There are seasons in life when the spotlight fades, when the crowds thin out, and when the chapters you thought were already sealed quietly reopen. Sometimes the greatest transformations don't arrive in your youth or in the height of your influence, but in the gentle, surprising dawns of later years. And it's in those unexpected dawns that God often writes stories we never saw coming. Which brings us to a woman most people hardly remember, yet her presence reshaped a legacy. After the death of Sarah, when Abraham's life seemed to be winding down, God began a new chapter. The Bible tells us that Abraham took another wife, Keturah, a woman introduced with little detail yet carrying immense significance. She appears briefly in Genesis 25, but that brief appearance tells a powerful story. Abraham, the father of nations, was not finished. Through Keturah, he would father 6 more sons: Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, sons who would become progenitors of tribes and peoples that influenced regions far beyond Israel. Her story is quiet, but its impact echoes across genealogies that shaped the ancient world. Keturah wasn't an afterthought. She was a vessel through whom God continued his promise of nations. Keturah enters the narrative at a point where many assume the story has already reached its resolution. Abraham had already seen Isaac born, watched God test his faith on Mount Moriah, and buried Sarah with reverence and sorrow. Yet Scripture presents Keturah not as a replacement, but as a continuation proof that God's purposes stretch beyond our expectations. Her sons became part of the vast mosaic of Abraham's offspring, influencing trade routes, regions like Midian, and future generations that Scripture continues to reference. Her role is subtle but essential, showing that God does not run out of ways to fulfill his word. Abraham's relationship with Keturah also reveals something about his character in his final years. Genesis makes it clear that while Isaac remained the son of promise, Abraham blessed his other sons with gifts and sent them to lands eastward. This wasn't rejection, it was stewardship. It was Abraham honoring each story God brought into his life while protecting the covenant God entrusted to him. And woven into that stewardship was Keturah, a woman who stood beside a patriarch whose faith had weathered decades of obedience, loss, miracles, and waiting. From Keturah's story, we learn that God can bring new beginnings long after we assume our meaningful years have passed. Many people believe purpose is tied to youth or early calling, but Scripture repeatedly shows that God delights in writing chapters no one expects. Keturah reminds us that God can introduce new relationships, new assignments, and new fruitfulness even at life's margins. If he did it for Abraham, he can do it for us because age, season, and history do not limit divine creativity. Her story also teaches us that significance is not measured by spotlight, but by obedience to God's placement. Keturah isn't described with fanfare. She doesn't speak a recorded line. She occupies only a handful of verses. But silence in Scripture does not equal insignificance. Some of the most powerful movements of God occur in lives that never seek attention. And for those who feel unseen, uncelebrated, or overshadowed by the greater stories around them, Keturah stands as a quiet reminder that God weaves eternal impact through those who simply stand where he places them. Finally, Keturah's place in Abraham's later years shows that healing, companionship, and restoration still matter to God even after devastating losses. After burying Sarah, Abraham's world must have felt emptied. Yet God, in his kindness, brought companionship again, not to replace what was lost, but to comfort what remained. The presence of God doesn't just lead us into promises. It also meets us after grief. Keturah represents the truth that God still cares about the heart of his servants even after their greatest assignments seem complete. In the end, Keturah's story may be short, but its message runs deep. She steps into Abraham's life when the world assumes the story is closing, and through her God extends Abraham's lineage, restores companionship to a grieving patriarch, and proves that His purposes are never constrained by our timelines. Her life reminds us that God is not done writing as long as breath remains in our lungs. And even in chapters that seem small to us, heaven is still making history.